All right, good morning. So glad to see you this morning. Hopefully you've never done that. I think I've probably come close a couple of times, though. Mike is still not doing well, still having some issues, so he asked me to preach this morning. So I'm going to ask that you continue to be in prayer for him in his recovery from surgery and everything that's happened since then. This morning, our message is about bitterness. Bitterness. Now, bitterness is kind of a weird thing because what starts out as anger then kind of builds into resentment, and then it turns into bitterness. And bitterness has this way of kind of grabbing a hold of things. And once it gets a hold of you, it's kind of hard to get rid of. It's kind of like that piece of gum in the carpet that you just can't, or that silly putty. Ooh. How many of you ever got in trouble for the silly putty thing as a kid? Yeah, the silly putty in the carpet happens. But harboring all of that bitterness, it is one of the most devastating things that can happen in your life. When you hang on to that bitterness, it affects your relationship with God, your relationship with others, and it affects your health. So today we're going to look at Ephesians 4:31 and 32 as our verses. So get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ God forgave you. So it says get rid of. So today we're going to be talking about how do we get rid of that bitterness? How do we get rid of it? Have you ever known someone who is bitter? You can see it. Every time you see them, you can see that bitterness is right there on the surface. Maybe they're bitter at God, blaming God for something that's happened in their life. Maybe they're bitter at a mate for something that they have done. Maybe it was over a breakup or a divorce. It could be bitter at a parent or a child. Maybe they're bitter at their employer for not getting that raise or whatever. So today we're going to look at what bitterness really is, because maybe you're a little bitter. There's a question that you could ask yourself. Yeah, I asked it myself, and it was bad. Whose failure would you secretly celebrate? No, just think about it. No out loud answers. Whose failure would you secretly celebrate? Kind of gives you a little clue. So, what makes a person bitter in the first place? It has to do with perceived sin. Someone has done something, or we think they've done something, they've sinned against us, and so we harbor some resentment towards that person. And then resentment builds into bitterness. We wait for an apology, and then when that apology never comes, it builds, and it builds. Somehow we've gotten this idea that before we can forgive someone, they have to apologize. When someone sins against us, we wait for an apology. And if we don't get it, we become bitter towards that person. Now, I'm always bringing something with me. You can tell I'm a teacher, right? Teacher at heart. This is the best iceberg that Walmart can give you for 99 cents. But as we know about icebergs, hint, the Titanic, what you see on the surface is not what's really there. It has to do with what's below the surface. So when you see someone that is angry, no, angry is generally a very short-lived, kind of a short-lived emotion. But what's behind it, what's underneath it, that's what fuels the anger. Because anger, it really can come and go quite quickly. But what fuels the anger is disappointment, fear, abandonment, resentment. It can be any number of feelings. But most of the time, those are all expressed as anger. In children, when I'm working with little kids, when I see a little angry little kid, I'm like, wow, there's more of this underneath. It's not just angry because they didn't get their way. There's something else there. Some kind of hurt that's been left there. So that's how we get angry. And then going into the bitterness is, like I said, it's that holding on and that resentment. And then it turns into bitterness. The word bitterness comes from the Greek word pikria, which means long-standing resentment. So, what are some characteristics of bitterness? How can you tell if someone's bitter? The best way, bitterness remembers details. Details. Now, most of what you've done in your life, you've forgotten. The older you get, the more likely that is. But, we have good things and bad things that happen to us. And the good things, we kind of bring out and kind of, oh, that was so nice. We put it away. But bitterness has this way of, you become obsessed with it. We go over the details. You can remember exactly where you were, what was said, the inflection of the voice. You remember every detail of that situation. Why? Because you've mulled it over again and again and again. We call that ruminating, like a cow chewing its cud. You're ruminating. You are sitting there just, going over it and over it. Because that's what fuels that bitterness. You go over it again and again. So, where there's bitterness, though, there's discouragement. With that discouragement, people who are bitter tend to take on a victim's mentality. That everyone is out to get them. That they have to be very cautious and careful about everyone around them. Become judgmental. They start to think that they can tell you exactly what somebody's motives are, no matter what they do. They start to get kind of paranoid about things. I mean, when we're talking paranoid, like they won't go to a football game because they think that every time the team gets in a huddle, they must be talking about them. So, it's that discouragement, it's that overwhelming, that judgmental, critical nature, those are symptoms of bitterness. So, why do we become bitter? Why do we become bitter? Well, first of all, because we think we have the right to be bitter. I mean, you don't know what they did to me. I have a right to be bitter. Bitterness is not based on how big the offense is. Doesn't matter how big it is. Bitterness, it doesn't have to be a big something that's happened in order for you to become bitter. It has to do with how close it is to you. It has to, because imagine, this happens all the time. Something tragic. Let's say, for example, a family is murdered in California. You can feel upset, a little angry, sad. But you're not going to feel bitterness towards the person that did it because you don't know that person. You don't know that family. It's not connected to you. In order for bitterness to sink in, it has to be a situation in which you are connected to that person. There has to be a connection, a relationship. It could be your child, your parents, could be your husband, your wife, could be your boss. There's a relationship there. That's where the bitterness comes in. And, you know, sometimes when people are talking about bitterness, they think that it has to be something big. No, it can be something little. Something little. Now, I've been guilty of harboring some bitterness. I had a coworker that told me once that she could not sit in the back seat of a car with me because of my voluptuosity. Woo! There was more that was said that day. I held my tongue. She just, we were in a group, and I held my tongue. But I can tell you that bitterness, it stuck there for a while. She said some things, it was like that whole entire, there was like 3 days, and she just kept on me the entire time. I never said a thing. I'm reading a book. And I'd look up at her, I'm like, where in the world is this coming from? And the lady that was in the far back, she was just like, oh, no, I'm done with this. And I was like, well, just leave it. She was ready to take the girl on for me. And I was like, no, just leave it. I was upset. I was hurt. And it came out as anger. And then the more I thought about it, it started turning into bitterness. To where every time someone said her name or I had to deal with her, I could just feel it in the pit of my stomach. And so that bitterness tends to grow. Now, when I say, and it seems kind of silly, but bitterness can grow from little things, like a child not taking out the garbage. 1 or 2 times, you're like, okay, they forgot. After about 50 or 60 times, the resentment's there. And after you have to keep reminding them over, it turns into bitterness. So it can be little things like that. So the one thing we're always looking for, though, is we're looking for that apology. We want that person to acknowledge that they have hurt us. We want them to apologize. Well, guess what, guys? It's probably not going to happen. If it does, wonderful. But have you ever had that situation where someone came and gave you an apology and you still had that kind of a feeling about them? The apology has nothing to do with the bitterness. It doesn't. Bitterness is not their problem. It's your problem. Their sin is their sin. But when you harbor bitterness and unforgiveness, that's your sin. When you hang on to it, that's where the sin comes in. So, I've seen people where I've been there when someone has apologized, a true heartfelt apology to another person. And then they go away, and the person that got the apology is like, they didn't mean that. Well, okay, if all it required was an apology, you got your apology, why aren't you letting it go? Because bitterness becomes a habit. It becomes a lifestyle. When you hold on to that, it has dug in, and it gets to the point where you don't have compassion for that person. And it flows over into other people. Your bitterness is not only is not only your problem, but becomes the problem of everyone around you. You ask your family members, hey, am I bitter? And they'll be like, oh, well, yeah, you know, you do kind of hold on to things a little while. So bitterness is our problem. So I guess the question is, what do we do about bitterness? There are 3 things that you can do about bitterness. The first one, you can keep it inside. Just harbor it, keep it inside. You do that, and it's going to make you sick. You will be miserable. It can cause problems with your heart, your blood pressure. It can make you sick. The second thing you could do is you could let it out. Well, there we go. Now let's make everybody sick. It's kind of like that contagious disease, that flu that's been passed around the group. Oh yeah, I know. There's a flu bug going around this group. I've seen the posts. But it is. It's kind of contagious. Now psychologists will tell you if you got a problem with someone, go and clear the air. Tell them that But the problem is it does make everyone else sick. I had an example of this. Actually, I've had a couple examples this last week, which is where the sermon came from. I was at Wendy's, not around here, but close, but not too close. I was in Wendy's ordering lunch for everyone else. I wasn't even getting lunch. I was being nice to the people in my office, and I'm getting all this, ordering all the lunch. And this woman comes in, very large woman, tall, Amazon tall, like 6'2" for a woman that's really tall. She comes in, and I take one look at her, and I'm like, ooh, this isn't going to go good. You could just look and tell something is about to go bad real quick. So I'd already placed my order, and I was waiting, so I was like, I think I'm just going to ease back away from this counter, And she comes up, and she demands to speak to the manager and starts yelling about how they got her order wrong. The manager's like, ma'am, I haven't seen you this morning. And she goes, no, last night. Wow. But the manager saw she was, escalating, so the manager's like, here, let me make you that sandwich. I am so sorry. She was very gracious. She made that sandwich, and she handed it to her. And all of a sudden, you see for a minute kind of some confusion come across that lady's face, and then she keeps yelling. And the manager's like, look, I wasn't even here last night. That's another shift. But she just kept on. And you saw that she really wasn't calming down. Then she dives over the counter. And I was like, oh, no. And she grabs a cup from the rack thing, and she says, I'm getting a drink. I think that was it for the manager. The manager was like, no, I'm calling the cops. You can't just be diving over the counter. And I'm like, okay, so I've made my way away from the counter, and I'm over by the door now, because I'm like, I'm making a break for it. And so the manager says, I'm calling the cops. So the cop, she's calling the cops, and the lady's yelling, call the cops, and then she stomps out of the building, right by the door I'm at. And I'm like, okay, lunch. Yeah, I'm picking up lunch for everybody. And I look, and I see that this woman has gone to her car, and she's coming back. Okay, well, having been a cop, yeah, no. They go to the car and come back. This is not good. So I'm looking at her hands, and I'm kind of like, okay, she doesn't have anything in her hands right now. She comes in, and she's yelling and just escalating more and more. And then my cute little cashier that's about like this big, little kitty girl, she says, your order's done. I'm got to get between this crazy woman, and I'm like, okay, thank you. And I said, if it's wrong, I'm not coming back. I was like, don't worry. But what did that show? It didn't have anything to do with that sandwich, did it? Nope. there were issues. There was some bitterness. Something. She was mad. And she was going to take it out on anybody and everybody around her. Unfortunately, that has become the way of our society. Road rage. Oh my goodness. You know, so that taking it out on everyone around them. So letting it out, not really the best way. The last one, dig it up. Hebrews 12:15 says, 14 through 16, it says, living in peace with everyone and work at living a holy life. For those who are not holy will not see the Lord. Look after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many. Love this description. The Bible describes bitterness as a root that is underground. It can't be seen. Kind of like our iceberg. You can't see what's fueling this. It's underground. But a root is very strong. You can see evidence of a root when it cracks the sidewalk, when it cracks your foundation. You can see evidence of a root. And the funny thing about a root, it's not really funny, it's really pretty obvious, is that the root of a lemon tree will never produce sweet peaches. The root of bitterness will never produce love. So, when we're thinking about bitterness, roots grow and they spread. And that's what they were talking about, is that bitterness, it spreads. Not just you, but your family, your church, your friends, the people you work with, it spreads. Your bitterness can spread. It's kind of like a magnet. It just draws people in as it goes. So how do you get rid of bitterness? Well, you got to dig up that bitter root. Anyone ever been working in the yard or something, get that big old clump of grass that you're like, and you finally just go, oh, forget it, and you just kind of cut it down? Didn't take care of the grass, did it? Nope, comes right back. Until you get that root and dig down and get that root out, it's not going to go away. So, first, you have to recognize your bitterness. You have to acknowledge that, hey, I am bitter about this. There's a tendency to look at the offender and to look at the offense and to focus on that and not focus on our own bitterness. So, before you can get rid of bitterness, you have to acknowledge that you're holding some resentment against that person. So, then you've got to realize that it's your problem. They may have handed you that problem, okay? They may have sinned against you. They may have done something to hurt you. They may have handed it to you, but it is your responsibility. You're the one that's hanging on to it. Like a piece of rotten fruit. They handed you that fruit, and you just won't let go of it, and it just gets worse and worse instead of dropping it. So realize that their sin is their problem, and that's between them and God to get straightened out. The bitterness about the situation, that's your problem. That's what you need to deal with. So, the third thing, confess it as your sin. Confess it. Bitterness is not based on what someone did to you. It's based on your reaction to what they did to you. So how do we deal, if we've got to confess this as sin, how do we confess this? First, you got to realize that it is a sin to hold bitterness against someone. Until you do that, that root is going to continue to grow. It may be underground, but it's still growing and becoming stronger. So you need to confess your sin. Dig it up by the root. Go back to where it is. Again, don't focus on what they did to you, but focus on your bitterness. My daughter's father left me when she was 2 months old, and I was in a hospital room with her. Yeah. I was working 2 jobs and going to graduate school. Yeah. And when I say he left, he walked out the door. Did not come back, has never paid a penny of child support. Ever. So, for a while, I was kind of bitter about it. And you know what? I felt like I had a right to be bitter. But I realized all that was going to do was just hold me to that situation. I was going to be tied to him and to that pain for the rest of my life if I didn't let it go. And so I really worked on it to the point where when my daughter would say, "Mom, why do I have only you?" I would say, "Well, that's because your father couldn't take care of you, and he knew that I could." Truth was, he wouldn't. But he really couldn't take care of her. Not the way that she needed to be cared for. I had to let go of that. And I did. I let it go. Now, I still don't care for him and his choices, but I feel sad for him because he has missed out on one of the most amazing individuals. That's his loss. That's his loss. So I had to let that go and keep that bitterness from eating me up so that we could move forward. Now, you may say, "Yeah, but you don't know what they did to me." Answer this question. How did Jesus respond as he was being crucified? The Bible lets us know that he could have called 10 legions of angels to come and save him, but he didn't. He simply said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." In Jesus, you can find that rest, that peace, and that healing and forgiveness for others. Jesus knows all about bitterness because that's what nailed him to that cross. When he rose from the dead, he brought victory over bitterness and over hate. And it's available to you. Let's pray. Dear God, since you chose us to be your holy people that you love, help us to clothe ourselves in mercy, tenderness, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Help us to make allowance for the faults of others. Help us to be obedient and forgive those who have hurt us, just as you have forgiven us. Help us to remember that the most important piece of clothing that we would ever wear is our love. We want that peace that comes from you to rule our hearts. We're called to live in peace and to be thankful. And Lord, we do thank you for our forgiveness. Thank you for hearing and listening to our prayers. In your name, amen. And in closing, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. and pray for those who mistreat you. Have a good day. Dismissed.